There comes a moment when your inner world stops bowing to the expectations that once shaped you. A moment when your confusion, once so familiar, dissolves into an awareness that feels both unsettling and liberating. You begin to see the subtle architecture of your relationships with a clarity that was impossible when you were still lost inside yourself. What once felt like connection now reveals itself as dependency. What once felt like love now shows its roots in your lack of self-recognition. And without warning, you begin to understand why some people were comfortable with the version of you who could not see your own worth. This shift doesn't arrive through conflict or confrontation. It arrives through a quiet recognition that you were living beneath your potential because doing so made you easier to carry. You were agreeable because you were unsure. You were available because you were afraid. You were loving because you were lonely. And now that you are finally questioning the unspoken rules that governed you, the balance begins to shift. Awareness unsettles the emotional economy that once held your connections together. It asks you to see what others hoped you would never notice, that your confusion made their lives easier. They knew how to comfort you when you doubted yourself. They knew how to guide you when you lacked direction. They knew how to stand taller in the spaces where you still struggled to stand at all. But now that you are beginning to step into yourself, their advantage dissolves, and what remains is the uncomfortable truth that they were more loyal to your confusion than to your clarity. This introduction is not meant to shame anyone. It is meant to illuminate the moment when your awakening disrupts the structure of the relationships built around your unawareness. This is the moment you realize that love given to the lost version of you does not always survive the emergence of the aware version. And this awareness becomes the beginning of your liberation. There was a version of you that people understood easily, even if you didn't understand yourself. A version shaped by uncertainty, softened by self-doubt, and guided by the quiet hope that others would tell you who you were supposed to be. This version felt familiar to them because it required little effort. Your confusion made your behavior predictable. Your insecurities made your boundaries flexible. Your hesitation made your needs easier to override. Without realizing it, you became the person who adjusted, questioned yourself, and apologized first because it felt safer to shrink than to risk losing acceptance. They felt comfortable with this version of you because it kept the emotional field level in their favor. They knew how to navigate you when you were unsure. They knew how to motivate you when you felt small. They knew how to support you in ways that reinforced their own identity as the stronger, wiser, or more stable one. Your confusion created a dynamic where they felt essential, needed, and in control. And as long as you remained lost, the relationship felt balanced to them. But the moment you began to awaken, the moment you questioned your old patterns and reclaimed pieces of yourself you had abandoned, the dynamic changed. Your clarity made you less malleable. Your self-awareness made you less dependent. Your truth made you less controllable. And suddenly, the version of you that once made sense to them began to fade. This is the first crack in the foundation, the moment when your awakening quietly disrupts the comfort others found in your confusion. They loved the you who needed them, not necessarily the you who finally learned to stand on your own ground. There were people in your life who would never admit it out loud, maybe not even to themselves, but they felt more grounded when you were struggling. Your pain gave them a sense of purpose. Your confusion made them feel wise. Your emotional instability allowed them to feel secure in comparison. Without intending to, you became the anchor they used to avoid drifting into their own unresolved truths. Your uncertainty gave them identity. When you questioned yourself, they felt certain. When you fell apart, they felt strong. When you doubted your worth, they felt valuable simply by being the one you leaned on. It wasn't malicious, it was unconscious, but it created an emotional economy in which your wounds funded their sense of importance. Your pain kept the dynamic comfortable for them. As long as you remained unsure of your own path, they could remain sure of theirs. As long as you needed reassurance, they could avoid confronting their own insecurities. As long as you stayed small, they could maintain the illusion of balance without ever having to grow. But the moment you became aware of your patterns, aware of your worth, aware of your truth, the structure collapsed. Your healing removed the emotional leverage they depended on. Your strength exposed their weakness. Your clarity highlighted the parts of themselves they were not ready to see. You didn't just shift. You unintentionally removed the very foundation they stood on. And when that happens, people don't usually say, "I'm struggling because you're growing." They simply fade. Not because your healing harmed them, but because their comfort was never rooted in your wholeness. It was rooted in your wounds. There were subtle moments long before your awakening when something inside you tried to speak. A quiet discomfort. A lingering ache. A sense that the life you were living did not fully belong to you. It wasn't loud enough to disrupt your routines, but it was persistent enough to unsettle your soul. You felt it in conversations that left you drained. You felt it in roles you played out of habit rather than truth. You felt it each time you swallowed your voice to keep the peace. Your intuition whispered long before you were ready to listen. It tried to tell you that the way you were living was a survival pattern, not a destiny. It nudged you when you stayed in relationships that demanded your confusion. It tugged at you when you remained in spaces that required you to shrink. It placed a tightness in your chest each time you agreed to something that betrayed your own knowing. But you silenced it to protect the very connections that were built on your self-betrayal. You convinced yourself that discomfort was normal. You reassured yourself that shrinking was love. You rationalized the patterns because breaking them would force you to confront truths you weren't ready to face. Staying small kept everything around you stable, even if it kept everything inside you restless. And those around you were perfectly content with you ignoring that inner voice. Your uncertainty made their lives easier. Your compliance kept the dynamics predictable. Your silence kept the emotional equilibrium intact. They never encouraged your intuition because your awakening would disrupt the structure they depended on. Yet the whisper persisted. It never left. It followed you into every chapter, waiting for the moment you were strong enough to hear it without fear. And when you finally did, your entire world rearranged itself around the truth you had been avoiding. Awareness didn't appear suddenly. It had been trying to reach you for years. There is always a precise moment, subtle, almost invisible, when something inside you shifts so deeply that the world around you can no longer interact with you the same way. It doesn't happen through a grand decision or dramatic turning point. It happens in a breath, in a realization, in the quiet instant you finally see the truth you've been avoiding. That moment is your awakening, and it marks the exact point where you stop being easy for others to navigate. Because once you become aware, you stop living on emotional autopilot. You stop agreeing just to keep peace. You stop absorbing the emotions others refuse to manage. You stop apologizing for having needs, boundaries, or clarity. You stop allowing people to translate your silence into permission. And the moment your awareness clicks into place, the entire emotional ecosystem around you feels the shift. Not because you changed who you are, but because you stopped performing the version of yourself they were attached to. For many people, this is when you suddenly become harder to love. Not because you became difficult, but because you stopped being easy to control. Your clarity disrupts the roles they depended on. Your self-respect removes the access they once had. Your boundaries expose the imbalance they avoided. Your honesty removes the illusions they relied on to stay comfortable. Awareness shines a quiet light on every emotional shortcut, every unspoken dependency, every imbalance everyone was pretending not to see. And people who built stability on your confusion feel threatened when you finally understand yourself. They say you've changed. They say you're distant. They say you're not the person they used to know. But what they're really saying is this: you stopped being the version of yourself that made my life easier. Awakening doesn't push the right people away. It pushes away the people who love the performance more than the person. When awareness enters your life, it doesn't arrive quietly. It rearranges everything it touches. Not because you force change, but because the truth inside you can no longer coexist with the dynamics you once accepted without question. This shift is internal, but its effects ripple outward, reshaping every relationship, every interaction, every unspoken agreement that once held your world together. Awareness recalibrates the emotional system of your life. You begin responding from consciousness rather than conditioning. You start choosing from truth rather than fear. You act from clarity rather than confusion. And this internal upgrade resets every connection around you. People who are aligned with your unconscious pattern suddenly feel a distance they cannot name. People who relied on your predictability sense something slipping from their hands. People who benefited from your emotional labor begin to feel the discomfort of responsibility returning to them. Your presence changes because you are no longer operating on the emotional settings they once controlled. You no longer react the way you used to. You no longer tolerate what you once overlooked. You no longer participate in dynamics that required your silence or your smallness. And this confuses people who were familiar with your previous version. They interpret recalibration as rebellion. They misread self-respect as rejection. They see clarity as coldness. But what they're witnessing is the natural reorganization of a system that was never balanced in the first place. Awareness exposes the truth of every interaction. Who was there for you and who was there for the version of you that dimmed itself? Who loved your soul and who loved your compliance? Who valued your presence and who valued your absence of boundaries? As your emotional settings return to their rightful center, relationships built on distortion begin to collapse. Connections rooted in truth begin to strengthen. Everything else falls away because it cannot survive the light. Awareness doesn't just change you. It recalibrates the world wrapped around you. There comes a moment in your awakening when people stop recognizing the person standing in front of them. Not because you've become someone unrelatable, but because you are no longer reflecting the version of themselves they were accustomed to seeing through you. Without realizing it, many people never related to you. They related to the mirror you unknowingly held up for them. When you were lost, your wounds mirrored their own. Your doubts mirrored their insecurities. Your confusion mirrored the chaos they carried inside themselves. You were familiar because you reflected the same emotional landscape they lived in. In that reflection, they found validation, comfort, and identity. But the moment you became aware, truly aware, the mirror shifted. Your clarity removed the familiar reflection. Your healing erased the version of themselves they preferred to see. Your self-understanding dissolved the emotional symmetry that once bonded you. This is why they receded. They could no longer locate themselves in you. People cling to mirrors, not truths. They feel safe around those who reflect their internal world back to them, even if that world is full of unhealed wounds. When you heal, the reflection changes, and what they see is no longer familiar, comforting, or convenient. Instead of recognizing themselves through your pain, they face the emptiness of what's unresolved within them. Your growth becomes a silent contrast to their stagnation. Your awareness becomes a reminder of what they avoid in themselves. And this discomfort pushes them away, often without a single word spoken. Your transformation doesn't just evolve your identity, it removes their anchor. They fade not because you became difficult to love, but because they lost the emotional mirror they once depended on. And without that mirror, they don't know how to relate to the person you've become. You didn't lose them. You lost the reflection that kept them close. There comes a point in your awakening when you suddenly realize how many silent roles you were performing to keep certain relationships alive. These roles were never discussed, never agreed upon, never consciously chosen. Yet you carried them as if they were obligations etched into your identity. You were the listener, the fixer, the peacekeeper, the emotional buffer. The one who absorbed tension so others didn't have to face it. The one who softened truths so no one felt uncomfortable. The one who stayed small so others wouldn't feel threatened. You didn't step into these roles because you wanted to. You stepped into them because the dynamics around you rewarded your compliance and resisted your authenticity. These roles kept the relationship balanced, but only because the balance depended entirely on your self-abandonment. When you were lost, these roles felt natural. When you became aware, they became impossible to maintain. Awareness exposes the emotional labor you were performing unconsciously. You begin to notice how often you apologized first, how consistently you absorbed blame, how predictably you regulated everyone else's emotions at the cost of your own. And once you see it, you cannot return to pretending you don't. The moment you stop acting the part, the dynamic collapses, not because you destroyed the relationship, but because the relationship depended on you playing a role that was never sustainable. People who relied on your silence feel uneasy when you start speaking. People who relied on your softness feel threatened when you become firm. People who relied on your emotional labor feel abandoned when you set boundaries. You didn't change the rules. You stopped performing them. And the truth is simple. Some connections survive your authenticity. Most do not. Because what fades is not your love, but the illusion that kept the relationship standing. You didn't lose people. You lost the stage on which they needed you to perform. There is a moment in your growth when the clarity you fought so hard to find becomes overwhelming for the very people who once claimed to care about you. Not because you weaponize it, not because you preach it, and not because you demand anything from them, but simply because your clarity exists. Awareness carries a presence that exposes what others avoid within themselves, even when no words are spoken. When you were lost, you made things easy. Your confusion created comfort for those who lived in their own confusion. Your uncertainty validated their indecision. Your wounds distracted them from their own. But when you become aware, you stop being a distraction from their truth and start becoming a reflection of it. And for many people, that reflection is unbearable. Clarity is confronting. It highlights the shortcuts they take to avoid responsibility. It reveals the patterns they refuse to change. It mirrors the depth they never cultivated within themselves. Your presence becomes a silent invitation for them to grow, and not everyone wants to see that invitation. Some people prefer the illusion of stability over the discomfort of self-honesty. When your awareness enters the room, the illusion cracks. They pull away because they feel exposed. Not judged, not rejected, exposed. Your growth forces them to face the mismatch between who they are and who they pretend to be. And instead of rising to meet you, many retreat to the comfort of the identity that feels safe, even if it keeps them stuck. Your clarity doesn't push people away. It simply makes it impossible for them to hide in the ways they used to. The more conscious you become, the more your energy disrupts the systems built around avoidance. And the moment you stop enabling unconscious behavior, the distance begins. They are not fleeing from your presence. They are fleeing from the parts of themselves your clarity reveals. Some relationships are maintained by mutual blindness, and the moment you open your eyes, the connection dissolves. Not because you change too much, but because they refuse to change at all. There comes a moment in your awakening when the distance between you and certain people doesn't come from conflict, arguments, or disappointment. It comes from resonance. Something in your inner world rises, and without effort, without intention, your energy begins moving toward a different horizon. You don't force it. You don't announce it. You simply grow. And growth has a direction. Before awareness, your emotional frequency matched the people around you. You shared the same wounds, the same doubts, the same unconscious patterns. You connected through pain, not purpose, through survival, not expansion. And in that alignment, everything felt familiar, even if it wasn't healthy. But when consciousness enters your life, your frequency shifts. You stop living through fear. You stop choosing from insecurity. You stop surrendering your intuition to keep peace. Your energy rises, and not everyone rises with you. Some people remain anchored in the emotional patterns you left behind. They stay attached to cycles you no longer feed. They cling to beliefs you have outgrown. And because of this, the connection loosens without either of you trying to make it happen. It's not rejection. It's not betrayal. It's energetic divergence. Two souls moving in different directions. Certain relationships cannot survive this shift because they were never built on truth. They were built on matching frequencies. And once the resonance breaks, the connection naturally dissolves. Not through anger, but through misalignment. Not through blame, but through evolution. As your energy expands, you begin attracting people whose values reflect your clarity, not your confusion. People who meet you in awareness, not in avoidance. People who walk beside you, not behind you. The distance you feel is not a loss. It is an opening. Your awakening is not pulling them away. Your awakening is pulling you forward. And the space that forms is simply the universe creating room for the souls aligned with who you are becoming. There comes a point in your awakening when it feels as if your entire internal system has been rewritten, not suddenly, not dramatically, but through a series of quiet recognitions that stack themselves inside you until nothing functions the way it once did. Your reactions shift. Your choices shift. Your tolerance shifts. Even your silence carries a different meaning. It is as if your inner software updated, and now the emotional programs that once dictated your life no longer run. Before this shift, people understood how to navigate you. They knew which doubts to lean on, which insecurities to press, which vulnerabilities would make you soften, apologize, or shrink. Not always out of cruelty, but out of familiarity. You were predictable in your pain. But when awareness enters the system, the code changes. You no longer respond to manipulation in the same way. You no longer engage in conversations that drain your spirit. You no longer carry responsibility for emotions that are not yours. The triggers they once depended on lose their power because you finally understand their origin. Your emotional settings reset to something truer, quieter, and more grounded. And those who interacted with the older version of you, the version that tolerated too much, explained too much, forgave too quickly, suddenly feel as if they're standing in front of a stranger. Not because you changed who you are, but because you stopped performing who they needed you to be. You become harder to control, harder to guilt, harder to manipulate, harder to keep small. Your clarity removes the places where others once found traction. This reformatting breaks unspoken emotional contracts they relied on. They can no longer access the parts of you that once kept them comfortable. You do not bend the way you once did. You do not dim the way you once did. You do not negotiate with your own truth to maintain a connection. You are running on new settings, ones they cannot operate with. Some people step back because they no longer know how to engage with the awakened version of you. They speak the language of wounds. You speak the language of awareness. The two no longer translate. This is not the loss of connection. It is the evolution of identity, and only those willing to update with you can continue the journey. There is a moment in your awakening when someone's absence stops feeling like a wound and begins to feel like air returning to a room that had been closed for years. It takes time to recognize it, because at first all you feel is the emptiness they left behind. But as you settle into yourself, a deeper truth rises. You did not lose them. You lost the version of you they were attached to. And that is liberation, not abandonment. When you lived from your wounds, you attracted people who resonated with those wounds. They met you in your confusion because that version of you required less from them. They connected with your softness because it asked nothing in return. They thrived on your self-doubt because it kept you available, compliant, and emotionally predictable. Your brokenness made sense to them. Your healing does not. As you begin to reclaim your voice, your boundaries, your self-respect, the emotional scaffolding that held the connection in place collapses. Not because you destroyed it, but because it was never built on truth. It was built on your willingness to carry more than your share, forgive what should have changed, and shrink to preserve a harmony that was never real harmony. When those people fade, it feels like loss until you realize what is actually leaving your life. The exhaustion, the self-abandonment, the emotional imbalance disguised as loyalty, the weight of relationships where your role was to absorb, soothe, fix, or remain silent. Their absence removes the demands that kept you disconnected from yourself. You start to notice how much lighter you feel without the emotional labor, how much clearer your thoughts are when you no longer manage someone else's storms, how much calmer your body becomes when you stop carrying expectations that were never yours to meet. You begin to understand that their departure created the space necessary for your expansion. You are not being emptied. You are being freed. Your life is no longer shaped by the patterns that kept you small. Your energy is no longer spent maintaining identities you outgrew. Your spirit is no longer compressed by the fear of losing people who were only attached to your earlier pain. What remains now is the space for alignment, a space where you can finally breathe without performing, caretaking, or shrinking. Their distance is not a punishment. It is a clearing, a quiet, necessary release of what could not travel with you into your awareness. You are not losing parts of your life. You are losing what kept you from living fully. As the echoes of the old connections fade, something subtle but unmistakable begins to shift around you. At first it feels like nothing is happening. The silence feels too open. The emptiness feels unresolved. But beneath the surface, life is reorganizing itself with precision. The clearing created by those who left becomes fertile ground for the people who are meant to stand beside the awakened version of you. Your true circle does not arrive with noise or urgency. It arrives with resonance. These are not the people who are drawn to your wounds. They are drawn to your truth. They do not need you small to feel safe. They meet you where you are, not where you used to be. You begin noticing a new quality in the connections forming around you. The conversations feel lighter, but deeper. The interactions feel honest without being harsh. There is no performance, no emotional guessing games, no silent pressure to shrink or soften in order to be accepted. You are not managing the room anymore. You are being yourself, and that alone becomes the filter. These people do not fear your growth. They respect it. They are not intimidated by your awareness. They are inspired by it. They do not compete with your clarity. They expand with it. It becomes clear, slowly but unmistakably, that alignment was never about quantity. It was always about frequency. Your true circle is composed of the souls who resonate with the person you are becoming, not the person you had to be for survival. This is when you finally understand why the earlier departures were necessary. You needed the empty space. You needed the silence. You needed the emotional room for something healthier to take shape. What is arriving now is not accidental. It mirrors your inner transformation. Your energy attracts what reflects your truth, not your wound. And for the first time, you realize that connection does not have to feel heavy to be meaningful. It can feel like breath, like recognition, like relief. This is the beginning of relationships built on transparency, reciprocity, respect, and spiritual resonance. The kind of connections that elevate you instead of drain you. The kind that encourage your evolution rather than fear it. The kind that walk with you, not behind you or ahead of you. These are the souls capable of witnessing your becoming. There comes a moment in your awakening when something inside you settles into a truth that feels both liberating and irreversible. You begin to understand that becoming aware does not kill love. It kills illusion. It kills the version of you that performed to be accepted. It kills the emotional patterns that kept you bending, softening, and shrinking just to be tolerated. What ends is not love. What ends is the performance you once mistook for connection. As your consciousness expands, you stop participating in dynamics that require you to pretend. You no longer silence your intuition to keep the peace. You no longer carry the weight of other people's emotional avoidance. You no longer offer your softness in places that demand your disappearance. And because of this, the relationships built on the older version of you cannot survive your awakening. Awareness reveals the truth about every connection, not to punish you, but to free you. You begin to see who loved you for real, and who loved the version of you that made their life easier, who valued your heart, and who valued your compliance, who connected with your essence, and who connected with your wounds. This clarity is not cruel, it is cleansing. For the first time, you are no longer negotiating with yourself to stay in rooms that cost you your spirit. You no longer choose belonging that requires self-abandonment. You no longer confuse attachment with compatibility or history with alignment. Awareness becomes the great filter, gentle, honest, and exact. It becomes clear that real love does not fear your awakening. Real love grows with you. Real love adjusts to your truth. Real love respects your boundaries and celebrates your clarity. The connections that fall away were never rooted in that kind of love. They were rooted in your unconsciousness, in habits, in wounds, in roles you did not choose but learned to perform. When those performances end, the relationships built on them end too. And this is where the deepest freedom arrives. You no longer grieve what is lost. You honor what is revealed. You understand that the cost of awareness is losing what depended on your absence. But the gift of awareness is finally living in the presence of your truth. This is not the end of your story. It is the beginning of your life without masks, without shrinking, and without hiding from yourself. Awareness does not take love away. It brings you to the kind of love that can actually meet you, fully, honestly, consciously.